The Boy Who Fell from the Mountain. Mark Maples was 15 years old when he visited Disneyland with his family on January 3, 1964. The Matterhorn bobsleds had been operating for nearly 6 years by then, thrilling guests with its 80-foot drops and sharp turns that simulated an alpine adventure. The steel-tracked ride, themed after Switzerland's iconic mountain, was the first tubular steel roller coaster in the world. Mark and his friend boarded a bobsled car in the afternoon, securing the simple lap belt that was the ride's only restraint system. As the bobsled climbed the initial lift hill, Mark was visibly excited. Other passengers in nearby sleds later reported that he had been daring his friend to raise their hands during the drops. The cars reached the top of the first hill, preparing for the signature plunge that made the ride famous. What happened next occurred in just seconds. At the crest of the hill, as the bobsled began to pick up speed, Mark suddenly stood up. Whether it was a moment of teenage bravado or a misunderstanding about the ride's mechanics remains unknown. The physics were unforgiving. As the sled pitched downward at 20 miles per hour, Mark lost his balance. His center of gravity shifted forward and the momentum pulled him completely out of the vehicle. Mark fell approximately 30 feet before striking the steel track below. Primary impact was to his skull, causing an immediate depressed cranial fracture. Bone fragments were driven deep into his frontal lobe. Though the brain damage was catastrophic, death was not instantaneous. Medical examiners later determined that Mark remained alive for at least 2 minutes after impact, his breathing shallow and irregular as his brain began to swell inside his shattered skull. Ride operators found him splayed across the track, still conscious but unable to move or speak. Blood pooled beneath his head, running down the manufactured mountainside in thin rivulets. By the time the park's medical team arrived, Mark had slipped into a deep coma. He was transported to a nearby hospital where, despite emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain, he died 3 days later without ever regaining consciousness. Christmas Eve catastrophe. Luan Fee Dawson was 33 years old when he visited Disneyland with his family on December 24, 1998. The holiday crowds filled the park as Dawson, his wife Lu Tui Vuong, and their daughter gathered near the sailing ship Columbia attraction. The Columbia was a full-scale replica of an 18th century sailing vessel that circled the rivers of America. The ship, weighing over 110 tons, was secured to the dock by heavy ropes attached to metal cleats bolted into the wooden deck. At approximately 6:15 p.m., as guests were boarding for the next journey, a cast member attempted to secure one of the mooring lines. The rope being used was not the specified marine-grade nylon, but a cheaper, less flexible polyester substitute that had been installed during recent maintenance. As the massive ship pulled against its moorings, the rope suddenly went taut with over 2,000 pounds of pressure. The strain proved too much for the substandard material. With a sound like a rifle shot, the rope snapped. The released tension sent the heavy metal cleat flying through the air at nearly 100 miles per hour. The 8-pound brass fixture became a deadly projectile, ripping free from its mounting bolts and spinning wildly toward the crowd of waiting guests. Dawson had no time to react. The metal cleat struck him directly in the skull, just above his right temple. The impact crushed his cranial bone inward with such force that bone fragments penetrated 3 inches into his brain. The traumatic injury severed blood vessels and destroyed critical brain tissue instantly. Neurologists later explained that while death was not immediate, consciousness was lost within milliseconds, as intracranial pressure spiked catastrophically. Blood poured from the wound as Dawson collapsed onto the festively decorated dock. His wife, standing just beside him, was also struck by the projectile as it ricocheted. The cleat tore through her cheekbone and jaw, leaving her critically injured but alive. Their young daughter watched in horror as both parents fell. Emergency medical technicians reached Dawson within minutes, but the injury was unsurvivable. Despite being rushed to the nearby UC Irvine Medical Center, he was pronounced dead at 8:48 p.m. Just as Christmas Eve celebrations around the park were reaching their peak, his death marked the first guest fatality at Disneyland directly attributable to mechanical failure rather than guest behavior or pre-existing medical conditions.